Let's talk more about the Indigenous voice. I know you all have different views on this, but we've got to delve into the issues. We're going to be voting in a referendum probably in a year or so. I want to bring in Dean Parkin, who's joined us before. He's the director of the From the Heart group. Good to talk to you, Dean, up there on Stradbroke Island. I've got to ask you first up, because you've been involved in this a long time like myself, and you know that the people who first really helped develop the idea of an Indigenous voice and this constitutional change were constitutional conservatives, many of them from the right of politics, looking at this as a way of doing something practical and constitutionally safe, as a way of avoiding some of the symbolism and, I suppose, difficulties of the ideas put up by the left of politics. Yet you have a lot of hardline conservatives railing so hard against it now. Why do you think that is?
Oh, I think they're coming out the gates a little bit too soon, Chris. I think there's been a bit of excitement since, obviously, the election commitment was made by the Prime Minister, and now the Prime Minister has answered the questions of many of those people in some ways to give detail about what's being proposed. And so I think what we need to do in a debate this important, and acknowledging the work that has gone on by so many people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, as you say, the constitutional conservatives that have helped pull this proposal together as well, is I think we've got to pay it a little bit more respect and assess the information as it comes out. And I think many people in the public and people out there in the Australian population are treating this with a lot of goodwill, and I think we owe it to them as well that we conduct this conversation in a way that takes on the information as it comes and argue the points on its merits and not get too far ahead of ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's very important, and I love that word respect in so many contexts, but it certainly applies to this debate, because I think the idea that people just dismiss this with a wave of the hand is really problematic, because whether you in the end agree with it or not, there's been an enormous amount of work over many, many years that's brought together an Indigenous consensus of some consequence in this country. So it needs to be considered pretty seriously. And of course, initially it was Malcolm Turnbull as Prime Minister who fobbed it off within days as a third chamber. Why is that argument wrong?
Well, the drafting that was released by the Prime Minister at Gama over the weekend comprehensively ends any question of these quite mischievous claims, let's be honest, Chris, that this proposition for a voice to Parliament was any way, shape or form a third chamber. It was never proposed by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples out of the Uluru Statement to be a third chamber. It was mischaracterised as such. And again, this is what's important about the detail that people have skipped over very quickly now with respect to the Prime Minister's speech, is that the words released by the Prime Minister put to bed any notion at all that this could be a third chamber of Parliament. It says very clearly that the responsibility for determining the structure of the voice is with the Parliament. So the politicians that are there right now can rest assured, knowing that they're going to be the ones that have the final say through legislation about what the structure of the voice will be. And I'm pretty sure they're not going to design a third chamber of the Parliament, Chris.
Well, absolutely. I had this debate with Andrew Bolt last night, and I mentioned the key wording of the second clause, which says that the voice can just make representations. So that shows it doesn't have the power to decide things or reject them. It can only make advice. And he points to that third clause about how the Parliament will design the shape and the powers of the voice. And he used that word powers as suggesting that could give it more power. Well, the point of that clause is it says, no, it's the Parliament that designs the laws to how the voice is going to operate. So that the Parliament can't actually pass laws to create a body then that's going to overwhelm it. It's obvious that the voice is completely subservient to the Parliament.
And that's been very clear from the outset, respecting the concept of the legal concept of parliamentary supremacy, that the voice would always do that. And that was I think that was the sophistication with which Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples addressed this issue through the proposal for a voice to Parliament, and saying, absolutely, we want to have a voice, and we want to have a voice that advises parliaments and governments on the issues that have a real impact on our communities. And we want to do so in a way that respects the integrity not only of the Constitution, but of the existing powers and functions of the Parliament as an important part of our democracy. So there's been a higher level of sophistication from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples all the way through to this point and getting to this point. And I'd encourage people who want to be involved in this conversation to exercise a similar level of sophistication in their thinking and their understanding. And as I said before, the respect, I think, that this very important issue facing our country deserves.
Well, someone you would know and would have worked with very closely over many years to try and get this proposal to this point is the Liberal MP Julian Leeser. Now he's the Shadow Indigenous Affairs Minister. Here's what he said about the latest proposal last night.
There's some big details that the government hasn't let us in on yet, and we want to hear from them. We want to understand how the voice bodies will work. Who will serve on them? How will they be chosen? What will their powers be? And how will they make lives of people in Indigenous communities better?
Yeah, I think we've got the most important detail, that is the constitutional amendments that should give everyone confidence about the issues we've just been discussing. But what about that detail of how Labor would propose to draft up the laws to shape the voice? Do they need to get a draft bill or some guidelines out to give people that detail soon?
I think the really key point here, Chris, is that every single voting Australian will know exactly what they're voting on when they go into that booth on referendum day, we think by the end of next year. It is very clear that we know this. And we've known this all the way through in going for constitutional recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. There's no place to hide in this. The easiest place to hide the detail would be just to leave it to the politicians and the parliaments to slip it through legislation. From the beginning, we've said we've got to put this to the Australian people through a referendum. There's no place to hide. We've known that from the beginning. And we know that the information that is required to give people confidence to vote yes will be there prior to the election. We've had the referendum. We've had the detail provided by the Prime Minister on the provision and the question on the weekend. The government has also said that they will release an exposure document relating to the details, the information around the voice by the end of the year. That will be another step in the process. And there'll be more steps in this process before the referendum. And I want to make this point, Chris. I know there's been a lot of people clamouring really for high levels of detail right now. Well, we've been talking with Australian people for the last 5 years and doing our own work through the campaign. And we know that those calls for detail are miles out in front where Australians are right now. We know that they've got a lot of goodwill towards this, but actually just swamping people with detail right at this point in time is not actually the best way to inform people. We've got to build that understanding over time, and we're going to see more information by the end of the year, and we're going to absolutely know what we're voting on come referendum time.
Great to talk to you again, Dean.
Thanks, Chris.
Dean Parkin there, who's the director of From the Heart. And I say again, if people really want to drill down into detail of what a voice could and should look like, you can just Google voice co-design final report. It's all available online. I'm certain that report done by the previous government, the Labor Party, will be looking at pretty closely. Not necessarily taking all of it, but it gives you a fair idea of the sort of things that are being discussed.